the first 4 converts as he sees them. Sorry, I just need to stop that phone call. He starts with, he calls it the conversion of Ruatara, though I doubt if it can really be described in that way. Then he talks of somebody I'd never heard of before, Maui, who went to the UK and connected with the very notable Anglican evangelical Basil Wood, and would appear to have probably been the first Maori convert, but in Britain, where he died in 1860. And then he talks in detail of the conversion of Karatiana Te Rangi, the brand plucked from the burning, as Henry Williams described him, who was baptised, I think, the day before his death, on the 15th of September 1825, and then the conversion of Rawiri Taifanga in February 1830, which marks the great moment of the tipping point when very large numbers of Māori were converted from that point. Now, what's interesting is that Falloon's argument, especially for the chapters on Te Rangi, focus also on a group of conversations. 10 conversations, to be precise. And Falloon goes through these conversations in great detail and includes the text of them in an appendix. So the first conversation begins somewhere between September and November in 1823, and it takes place at Waitangi, and it's between Henry Williams, William Fairburn, who I think must have been the translator throughout this group of conversations, and what later turns out to have been a group of Māori, among which is Te Rangi, that very first convert in New Zealand. So here is the description that Henry Williams gives of it. The following is the substance of a conversation we had some time ago at a village a mile distant. Remember, he's in by here, so that makes sense. Which was exceeding pleasing to me, both from the interest the party expressed and also from the picture they composed, the great variety of countenances which were assembled as I have yet beheld, young and old, chiefs and slaves, sick and blind, or nearly so. Mr. Fairburn and myself, having taken our station on the ground, the people formed a circle, and then he proceeds to describe this conversation in which they touch on the great atua, as they describe God, and, trust Henry Williams, the need to observe the Sabbath, which he, of course, places on a higher plane than the conversion of the people. The first step would be the observation of the Sabbath. Then they're back on Good Friday in 1824, and again, it's Fairburn, Williams, and, I take it, Te Rangi, but also some of Te Rangi's family. Actually, Te Rangi is probably missing on that occasion because he says the great chief is absent. Again, I think Fairburn is obviously the translator, and in the conversation, which is totally one way, and that's the difference between your conversation and this, Williams just pushes endlessly for the briefest comments back in return, the logic of what the death of Jesus meant and the resurrection of Jesus. Then they're back on the 17th of October to discuss the subject of death with another rangatira, Hepatahi is his name. And then there's a further discussion, and the rangatira explains, justifying why there's very little interest from the people. They did not care about such things. All they thought of was eating and drinking and fighting. That had he told them, they would not have come. He said, if we'd come to talk about anything else, or to give tokens, that's items of trade, we should have had numbers. So, that is a point where you had to attract people to come along to the conversation. So it's a very intriguing description of a gradual shift in Māori opinion that's there in these discussions. Then by the fifth meeting, they further talk to Rangi, and in Dialogue 6 there's a chief from Tauranga who has never heard this kind of conversation before and is totally confused. Here, our old friend, the old chief, Te Rangi I presume, remarked with considerable energy that if Shunghi, as that's the way that Hongi is described often in these papers by the Europeans, and some other head chiefs were to believe, they would have plenty of followers to listen to them, as they now have to go to the fights. So the distraction of the musket wars, has got them completely disinterested in this missionary circumstance. However, by Dialogue 7, Rangi is very sick, and from 7 to 10, there is an increasing focus upon his sense of the fear of death. And on the brink of death, there's a long description of his decision to be baptized. And then in the final dialogue that Falloon reports in his thesis, they talk to his widow about what has happened. And that's on the 2nd of October, 1825. And just 2 months later takes place the conversation that you report, although with slightly different assembly of missionaries and a different translator. And that may be significant. So I think undoubtedly though, word, even if this is in Kerikeri, word would have spread of what had happened at Waitaki 2 months earlier. But equally, plenty of discussions about the slaves that they brought back when they returned from the fighting. And, as we see, the building of the ship in Pahia, which you cleverly find in that conversation. And, as you say, the respect for the fact that they built the house, that Paki has helped build the house for Hongi on the marae at Kerikeri must make a difference. So this meeting at Kerikeri, with its frank discussion, is one of any number of conversations that must have taken place. And the different members who take part in those conversations, I think, reflect different tones, different people, but also follow somewhat similar trends. It's very interesting then that the primary reason that the meeting seems to have been called, and very carefully called, Henry Williams is going to come over to George Clark's house to be there for this discussion, because he's very concerned at this way in which Ngāpuhi are going off to fight wars in the south, and he wants to stop the warfare. And it seemed to me one could imagine Henry Williams, remember the naval man with his experience in Napoleonic warfare, he knew all too well the destruction of warfare, and his alarm at the possibility of death, his concern about the consequences for Maori society in the bloody sequence of events that we call the Musket Wars, and the hint of peacemaking that Williams and others will take on at a later stage, and that's very intriguing. I was so interested to listen to Jeff Troughton's comments at the Wellington launch on that very subject. But then, of course, we have William Gilbert Paki there providing the translation, and Richard Davis writing the summary of this conversation. So there are different players to some extent than the Fairburn-Williams sort of total control, which I think is quite significant, because Williams kind of dominates the way we think about missionaries in the 1820s anyway. And Paki, with his background that Adrian has so delightfully described when you've done the journal of his father and his uncle, and that extraordinary story of the LMS missionaries who end up in a rather sorry state in Sydney, but he does work as the carpenter at Pahia for a significant period. And William Gilbert Paki, of course, refuses to go to Waipu and insists that he's going to stay right here in the Bay of Islands. It's quite intriguing. Grant, you describe something I never thought about before, that the translator is the facilitator of the conversation. And that is a very interesting insight, where, I mean, Henry Williams Māori can't have been great. He would have followed very little of the conversation, maybe. But Paki, with his intuitive grasp of Māori, playing a key role in the translation committee for the Bible, is able to help. And I think you've helped me to see how significant that is. And then you enter into the subtlety, the complexity of the encounter, and I realise that what lacks in my background, I have never been a counsellor. And the counsellor can see fascinating dimensions in this conversation that, as you indicated, Adrian, there's something there in the interchange where careful listening shows up some of the dimensions, which turn in the end on the missionaries wanting to hear from the Māori, accepting that the missionaries came with araha. And that becomes the, if you like, the ending of the conversation. Now, I noticed with great interest that this is book 3 in an 11-volume series, which you haven't yet quite finished, but that's the ambition. Yes, that you, and I'm so pleased that you and Adrian are working together, because Adrian's done such marvellous work on the LMS and the CMS and many of those dimensions. And Paki and his significant role, maybe played down sometimes, but Paki was just as important as his colleague Matthews, I think, in Kaitaia. And of course you work on the economic dimensions of missions. And I remembered, Adrian, that I spoke at your own book launch back at St. Luke's in 2018?
Yes, 2018.
And the fascinating story of that Paki tradition. You know, we're at a time when there's quite a lot of debate goes on about the relationship and the role of missionaries in the early history of Aotearoa. And there have been quite contrary discussions of the same encounters. You can take, say, Alison Jones's fascinating book, Words Between Us, which are largely, in her interpretation, words that do not really meet, that there's, as she sees it, almost complete misunderstanding so often. On the other hand, there's Tony Ballantyne in Entanglements of Empire, which shows so many interconnections and reminds us that missionaries weren't anything to do with the colonial encounter, and yet they were everything to do with the colonial encounter, and that's the difficult bit that we need to grapple with. The flags flying over the mission station were in some way connected with the British Empire, and in some ways completely independent from it, with their own unique CMS cross, which of course became the flag of the independence, of the Maori independence in 1835. So, Grant, I think this little book, in its tight, neat, in conclusions, this wonderful title that Grant uses for the final section of this, I think marvellously expresses the exploration that each side is having with each other, and this hinge on what is the attitude of each to each, and the fascinating exploration of how, firstly, rangatiratanga becomes, of all things, gentlemanship, the way that it's translated by Paki, it seems, and the way that aroha binds the two together. Thank you so much for what you've done.
Thanks.